the thing that kept coming into my head was, how do we anticipate the unprecedented? And what does that look like in terms of how we think about, as organizations, planning and preparing and really responding to wildfires going forward? So if I were to come up with a single slide to capture the season in one slide, this would be it. This is the daily maximum temperature in BC on June 28th, which is 2 days before the Lytton wildfire struck that community. You would have to go to the Tatsunshini or Mount Robson to find somewhere in the province that was less than 20 degrees maximum temperature. And you can see the overwhelming majority of the province was above 30. We don't have a 40 plus kind of color bar in this map, but if we did, you'd see that in substantial parts of the southern interior of the province as well. So this really speaks to the heat dome and the effect that had on this fire season, and gives you a sense of, again, anticipating the unprecedented. We've never seen a map like this before in BC Wildfire Service or BC generally. So it speaks to the kind of season we had and what we were confronted with. It's not just about the heat dome. What we saw earlier in the spring, the situation emerging in the southern interior was really a kind of more prolonged drought trend over the winter and into the spring as well, with precipitation well below averages. And so we saw that play out into the summer as well. If you want to look at sort of the lightning statistics, this is one of the key things we monitor and track. There were 300,000 lightning strikes in BC between April 1st and September 20th. So that gives you a sense. If 60% of the fires in BC roughly are lightning caused, it gives you a sense of kind of what we were up against. The challenge this year was that there was significantly less rain with those lightning events and lightning systems as they passed through BC. And in that July window, which was really kind of the critical window for us, which we'll speak about in a minute, there were over 180,000 lightning strikes, which really sort of drove the fire behavior over the summer. So this graph shows the maximum daily temperature in Kamloops, just as sort of an indicator, a rough indicator of what the weather did over the summer, the weather conditions we were faced with, and then fire detections over the same period. So you really see that sort of end of June to the first week of July, that spike with the heat wave, followed by the breakdown of that heat dome and the lightning activity that followed it. That really set the mold for our fire season. And if you want to look at what that meant in terms of our activity as a firefighting organization, the green line here is what we call our DEC, our daily estimated fire suppression cost. So this is a proxy for the activity on the land base from a firefighting perspective. So what you see is sort of getting to the end of July, we're looking at about, less than $1 million a day. And within a course of about 5 to 7 days, we moved up to about 7 million and didn't really drop below that level until well into late August. And it gives you a sense of just how prolonged and intense the season became once we moved into the July-August timeframe. And then you see it dropping off after the weather turned sort of mid-August. When we add it all up at the end of the season, 1,610 wildfires for about 870,000 hectares burned in total. Where that happened was really concentrated in the province, although the fire activity was spread out, between the southeast Kamloops and Caribou largely. Prince George did see some Cutoff Creek being one of the major fires there, also some fires in the northeast in Fort St. John area. But when you look at the hectares burned, that Kamloops Fire Center activity was really disproportionately impacted. And that's an indicator of the conditions on the ground that those fires hit. And, the fuel condition in particular and weather conditions over the summer really drove significant growth in fires in that fire center in particular. And that's really indicative or indicated by the wildfires of note. These are the significant wildfires that we typically sort of drive our activity as an organization and have significant concerns from a public safety perspective. 7 of the 11 here that are shown in red were in the Kamloops Fire Center. There were also wildfires of note over, these are just the ones over 19,000 hectares. There were many more wildfires to note over the summer, but these are the big ones. 7 of the 11 in the Kamloops Fire Center. Sparks Lake, northwest was the biggest of those, the most hectares. This is some preliminary analysis from Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch. This would be the live forest managed land base volume within the fire perimeters. This is not actual timber loss, to be clear. Timber loss is a function of fire severity, and that analysis is being done right now, but it gives you a sense of the volume within those fire perimeters, within the forest managed land base. By tenure type. So you do see the community forest volume within those perimeters. Again, that's not the impacted volume, that's not the salvageable volume or the volume loss, but just the volume within those areas. And this is a preliminary analysis. There'll be more detailed analysis. And I think that Garrett and Tom are really going to get into the details of what this looked like for their individual community forests, which and those two, Slocan and Logan Lake, are really the most significantly impacted this season. In terms of area, just a few stats. We saw fire perimeters areas 13% of the Lillooet TSA, 7.5% of the Merritt TSA, 5% of the Okanagan TSA, and then TFLs as well were fairly significantly impacted. TFL 23, the Arrow Lakes complex, about 11% of the area in the FMLB impacted in one way or another. About 30.5% for TFL 49 west of Vernon, and then 27% of TFL 59, sort of east of Oliver and Osoyoos. The other kind of tagline for the summer is it was everyone was all in, and we really want to take time to acknowledge our partners and their contributions and efforts, starting with nations. First Nations were critical partners for us in meeting the challenges of the summer. We saw levels of partnership that really just were really remarkable, not only with our liaisons and knowledge keepers in the nations coming to the table, bringing forward their knowledge of the land base, and then working in partnership with us to develop response plans to protect their communities and the values that that are important to them on the land base, but also just generally knowledge of fire and fire behavior in their traditional territories. This year we saw SIMP launch an initial attack crew that was fully integrated into our operations, but really their own attack crew doing initial attack within SIMP territory, and that's a model that we're very keen to expand to other nations where that capacity exists, and work with nations to build that capacity where it doesn't. Out of province support, we had 900, a little over 900 folks come up from across Canada, both federally from Parks Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces, also other provinces, and then we had over 100 firefighters from Mexico, and about 36 folks from Australia who traveled across the world during COVID to help us out. It really was indicative of the support that we had from that broader community of firefighting organizations. And we had about 625 Canadian Armed Forces personnel and Canadian Coast Guard personnel cycle through over the course of the summer, largely tasked in the 100-mile area and the South Okanagan. Our other partners, obviously, the forest industry and community forests, and then our contract community really stepped up this year. Those partnerships ended up being completely integral to our ability to make it through the summer, collectively and together. When we saw, over 600 forest industry personnel, over 1,400 contract personnel come in to join the fight. Just to kind of look, where does this fire season fit within the overall pattern from a number of fires perspective? It's not extraordinary, but it really was, to John's point, it was the year of the interface. And so what we see, how does it compare to 2017 and 2018 in particular is a question we very often get coming out of this season. From a total fires and hectares burned perspective, it really, it kind of comes out in the average, not extraordinary, but what was extraordinary were the evacuation orders and alerts that we saw this year, which is really indicative of where the fire was. It was on the doorstep of communities in the Kamloops Fire Center and in the south in particular. And then resources and the resource constraints we faced this year, not within our own organization, but more broadly. And the reason for that, there's two primary reasons for that. One is COVID, and that really constrained other jurisdictions' ability to provide resources. But more significantly, this was the year of fire everywhere in North America, everywhere from Ontario east and south to Mexico was experiencing very, very serious fire conditions, which really brought a lot of pressure onto the collective pool of resources. And there was a lot of competition for those resources, the resources that did become available among those jurisdictions. So whereas in previous seasons, we were able to recruit and bring in folks from other jurisdictions, this year, we just weren't dealing with the same number of resources we had in 2017 and 2018. So just to step back, that's the season in review, and obviously a fairly high-level summary. There's lots more to dig into there, and I think we'll get into some specifics in Garrett and Tom's case of what that looked like on the ground. I look forward to that conversation. Shifting to kind of where we're going as an organization, we're really guided by the higher level direction of government in terms of our evolution as an organization. There's a couple of key policy intentions and commitments the government has made or is making that really are going to steer where we go as an organization. The one right off the top is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act and the action plan coming out of that. Working in partnership with First Nations is something we've embraced wholeheartedly as an organization and continue to evolve what that looks like through all the phases and components of our work. We're very keenly interested in building those partnerships. And I think we've demonstrated without a doubt the value of working together this summer. We're learning, as every part of government is, and learning with our Indigenous partners how to make that work. But we're fully committed to moving forward in a good way in that sense, and finding those partnerships that are just going to demonstrate the value of continuing to work together. BC is modernizing its emergency management legislation guided by the Sendai framework, the international UN framework, really shifting from a focus on disaster response to disaster risk mitigation, and really focusing on all four pillars of emergency management. Our organization is moving into that space in a very serious way as well, moving from a predominant focus on response and into mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and a balanced focus across all of those. The Abbott-Chapman report continues to guide our work. It is sort of a pathway that was laid out for us very handily in that work. I know many of your communities would have been engaged in that work. It continues to guide us as an organization and provide us direction on where we need to move. And so we continue to use that as a bit of a reference point as we evolve. The Forest Policy Intentions paper, there are some specific things in there. There's a specific commitment around cultural and prescribed fire and expanding the use of that in forest management, but also integrating forest planning and fire planning, forest management and fire management. As much as those trees are a timber resource, they are also fuel, and we need to be managing them as both going forward. And so you'll see even in the FERPA legislation that was tabled yesterday, if you were to do a word search in that for wildfire, you would find some innovative sort of new tools and approaches to do that. And then obviously the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy under the Clean BC initiative provides some fairly clear direction to government as a whole about where we need to go, and our organization as well, in terms of getting ready, anticipating the unprecedented, and moving our organization in the direction of where we need to go in light of those broader climate trends. So just at a very high level, our intent as an organization, and this is captured in our strategic plan and is captured in many of the conversations that we're having now as we review the season and start to do our strategic planning for the next year and 3 years and 5 years and 10 years. This season, without a doubt, was hard on our people. It was hard physically. We had teams out there for 5 and 6 deployments, which will wear anyone down. It was also hard on our people psychologically. I think the Lytton incident, the loss of Lytton, left a mark on our organization, and dealing with a level of public scrutiny and commentary that I don't think we had experienced as significantly in the past as we did this year. We really need to make sure that we're taking care of our people. And when I say our people, I don't mean our staff and BC Wildfire Service, but everyone who joined the fight. Really investing in that capacity and keeping our people safe and well is the number one priority of our organization. Investing in our partnerships, partnerships is the theme from this year, and really doubling down on that. And that includes community forests, includes the forest industry, includes First Nations, includes our contract community, our other provinces, and our out of country jurisdictions, as well as outside of the firefighting, specifically partnerships with research institutions, the partnerships in the innovative realm with innovation organizations and things like that. We're all in on partnerships. A learning culture is very important to us, and really this is about adaptation and learning from every new season and everything new that gets thrown at us. It's the learning opportunity that we need to seize in those moments that's really become central to us. And really, as I mentioned before, shifting into a fully 4-pillar organization, focused on those 4 pillars of emergency management. And the other thing is that wildfires don't stand in isolation, and anyone who couldn't make it through the Trans-Canada Highway because of landslides post-fire this season would understand it's not just about fires. We need to look at fires, because as the seasons become earlier and earlier, we need to look at how we're dealing with fires and floods on the same land base, landslides, drought, and other things. So really taking an integrated and holistic approach on that. And then finally, and this is something I think that Chris and Kelly will touch on in more detail, really this focus on managing for resilience. Really critical that we continue to do this. And I think that with the new FERPA legislation that was tabled yesterday in the House, we have a broader array of tools to be able to do this, working with our forest management partners. So I'll stop there. I think that's it for me. And I look forward to further conversation and questions when we get into them.
Tony, thank you for a very informative presentation. It really helps us understand the scale of the wildfires of 2021 and at a provincial level, and what your organization has learned from it and is doing going forward. I think it really sets the stage to now zoom in and take a look at that and understand what it feels like from a local level. Garnet, you're in Logan Lake. Why don't you help us understand what 2021 was like in Logan Lake?
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, John. And thank you, Jennifer, Susan, Carly, for getting us all coordinated here. I get that there's been some tech trouble, so appreciate everyone's patience on that. And Tony, great job at setting the stage for what we're about to talk about here. So as I mentioned in my intro, I am with the Logan Lake Community Forest as part of the team there that we manage. And it would be, I guess it's just important that we also recognize that when we do our work or stewardship on our tenure area, we integrate with our 26 different First Nation groups when we do referrals. And a fun fact is that Logan Lake is actually named after some Skeetchison members, Annie and Gabriel Logan, who used to live in the area. So we like that. And I'm presenting today from the Tk'emlúps Secwepemc traditional territory, which is Kamloops. Okay, so 15 minutes, we'll make it snappy. I'm going to be keeping it simple. What happened, what we did, and what we feel is the next steps. So I'll just start off with, that's a photo I took at the heart of Logan Lake. It's Meigs Park, looking out towards the north in our recreational trails area that we've been planning to do some operations in. So pretty significant event. If I just turned my camera a little bit more to the north, that's what was going on. I can't say thank you enough to all of the first responders that came to support the community, and the many volunteers that were there to serve the meals and just help all those first responders as well. we're truly grateful for all of that support. And of course, the citizens of Logan Lake who really just played along and did the evacuation, followed the orders that we needed them to do, and it was fantastic. So thanks to everyone that was part of that. I am going to focus on the sort of the forest management side of things, but within 2 weeks, we had the premier flying in and having a look to see what we went through as a community. That was actually really important. And, standing there is Hugh Murdoch, who was the incident commander at the time of the wildfire in Logan Lake. So it was just a real pleasure and privilege to serve with Hugh side by side there. So June 30th, Tony really set the stage there on his first slide. That's a great graphic. I hadn't seen that one before on the average temperatures across the province. That's what my vehicle was telling me the temperature was on June 30th, 47 degrees outside. The heat dome, obviously that was setting the table for us. July 1st, the lightning strikes hit. We had some in Kamloops. We had a whole bunch happen across the community forest tenure. And that's when we started our tap dance. We started to really serve the different areas of emergency management and response in this case, providing line locators, equipment supervisors, supporting the EOC center in Logan Lake, and being a liaison officer, which was the role that I was called into during the wildfire. So the Tremont Wildfire was the one that actually came into town. It was August 14th. Remember that day, probably the rest of my life. 63,000 hectares. We saw that on Tony's slide there. Large scale wildfires, landscape level, approximately 35 kilometers from its point of origin in Ashcroft. Pretty significant. And human behavior is always fun for me to watch. And we have that little quote in there. I don't think anything's going to happen here, but I could be wrong. So that always emphasizes to me, there's always work to be done with communication, education, and reaching out to our community. But clearly we did have things go a different way. So how did we get here? How did we get invited into the tent? This is the incident command team for the Tremont fire in Logan Lake. August 12th, the community was evacuated. August 13th, I was making phone calls to see what I could do to get involved. August 14th, I was deployed. That's when the fire hit. So overnight it happened, but it wasn't an overnight process is what I'm going to share. So 2003, so in 2019, I presented at the Mission Conference, and I spent a fair bit of time talking about our history as a Firesmart community. And really the legacy started with Tom Lacey here, retired BC Wildfire Service individual. And then we had bark beetle, and we had a community wildfire protection plan put in place. We've updated that. We've done landscape level planning. We've put a lot of effort into this. It's 18 years to be an overnight success. And I think it's important that we're looking at sort of the bigger picture at the landscape and for a community forest tenure, anyone with a tenure like that. So here's my stock car racing t-shirt. It's all our sponsors. We've got so much to be proud of in the work that this community has been at since 2003. Like I said, 18 years. It was really a focus of the 0 to 500 meters is how we triaged it. And if you live in Logan Lake, you pretty much know the wind comes from the south and the fire is guaranteed to come from the south. That's just what's going to happen. It's obvious. And so all our effort was put to the south. And then it was recent years, say in the last 4 or 5 years, that we started to focus on the north. Obviously, if you remember our first slides, our fire came from the north. So at a tactical level, what happened? I'm just going to see if I can do a little bit of highlighting on my slide. We'll go right here. Okay, so we've got a treatment unit right here. We've got a treatment unit right here. Another one here. We have a cut block, cutting permit 10, block 4 that goes along like this. And then we have the rest of our fuel management treatments going. Actually, I did that wrong. It goes down here and around like that. And another one off to the side here. So those are all our treatment units on the northern flank. I'll just change color here again. And we had the advantage of time. We knew the fire was coming for about 2 days, or we were anticipating it. And so dozer guard was built along here and up through the block, down along here and across. So that was the dozer guard that was put in, and it was used as a tactical ignition. So as the wildfire was coming from the north, BC Wildfire Service crews did a hand ignition throughout our treatment zones and did a burn off towards the head fire. So it was fantastic. Easy line locating. I mean, that's kind of the advantage of the treatments. It provided easy line locating. Dozer guard construction was simple. It was quick. It was easy. It was safe for crews. Air tanker support was there, of course. And all of that, it was more effective in the penetration down to the ground. And just to shore it all up, it also allowed our structural firefighters to, leave the pavement a little bit and go in a couple hose lengths and really get their nozzles on things. And that was, again, a huge advantage of having all our fuel treatment areas in advance. It's roughly about 40 hectares that was impacted during the wildfire of the 350 hectares that we did in total around the community over 18 years. Just another tactical piece here I'll share. This is a map that was rolled out in front of me. God bless Gord Parker, who was coordinating all of the structural folks from BC Wildfire Service. We had provided our shape files for where everything was. And, the reality is when you get into a situation like this, you don't always have the best information in there. So thankfully I was able to connect with Gord. He asked, hey, where are your treatment areas? It came down to a Sharpie. So I was able to grab his Sharpie and just add to his map and draw on where road locations were, where treatment units were. So anyway, the Sharpie is sometimes your best weapon too. Okay, so this is what it looks like post-wildfire. That's where the ignition was done, going towards the head fire. Of course, the heat and the fire intensity is lower because it is an ignition, but huge success in my mind. The general treatments folks I want to know this. We reduced the canopy bulk density by spacing and opening up the stand a bit and pruning. So when you prune, you create that strata gap between the surface fuel and the crowns there. And then we reduce the surface fuel loading by just picking up sticks, we call it. You could think of it as anything 20 centimeters and lower. I like to leave coarse woody debris behind and, old veteran snags, things like that. I do like to keep them behind because we're always obviously managing for more than just fire and fuel when we do our activities. I think what's kind of neat is Dan Layton was the fire chief in Logan Lake for so many years and such a champion of the Firesmart program. He happened to be coming through on holidays immediately following the fire. So he gave me a quick phone call. I happened to be in town. I was like, okay, let's do this. So him and his wife, we went out and got a good shot of us together. It was kind of a celebratory moment, and it sure felt good to, experience the success that we've put so much work into as a team and combined effort. And I think that's one of those tenets of Firesmart that I really do appreciate, the multi-pronged approach. And if you look at the background of this photo, you can really see, that was an area that went through ignition as well. And there's lots of fine fuels left behind and twigs and grass and things like that, all of that fuel, surface fuel, is just completely consumed when you just leave the treated areas. And so this slide here is literally, 50 to 100 meters away from where Dan and I were standing in that previous photo. And, you can see the level of devastation. And I think it's such a key piece for us. We want to ask ourselves now, well, what can we learn? Here we are with the F-bands. I was so grateful to be working side by side with them in the trailers and Kamloops here, the fire behavior analysts, such a high level of expertise. And for the opportunity to go with them out in the field and listen to them talk about what they see out there. As a community forest manager and a management team, I can't think of anything better. It's just a fantastic way to close the loop on some learning. Of course, it's not just the 11 values of FERPA. We really need to start connecting the dots, and Dave Gill and Mick did a great job of sort of talking about that as well as the Wet'suwet'en folks there, Colin and David. That was fantastic to hear their perspectives. We're very much aligned with that as well as a community forest, and we're more than just the legal pieces there. And here's some bears, lots of bears in the fire, and just behind there is the fire where it burnt. So again, non-legal values are critical to us. Forest professionals managing this, it's about social license and public trust. We have to raise the bar. We have to be representing what that means. To Doug Kelly's point on the economies of scale and more complex management, yeah, you bet it is. This is not simple work, but it's important. Perhaps you'll look at rates going down instead of going up. That would be great. So here we are. I talked earlier about a landscape level approach in 2018. Tony talked about partnerships. We've been in partnerships with BC Wildfire Service for many years now. I can't stress that enough. It's such an important part of who we are and how we're successful and how we view success. If you look in the center there, that's Hugh Murdoch, who was, again, the incident commander during the fire. In 2018, during the winter, putting the effort in to come out to all our meetings throughout the winter. Fantastic commitment by the BC Wildfire Service to support us in our planning processes over time. And again, we're looking at this similar to their RSWAP, the resource sharing wildfire allocation protocol, and is driven by human life and critical infrastructure. So I like to think of the 4 legs of emergency management, and maybe we haven't been on an even kilter here. And this is a good place to reflect on that. I'm buoyed to hear Tony mention a shift in focus, because we have such a deep concern on the focus on response. And there's an emergency happening across this province with all these communities, whether it's community forest tenure around them or not, where we're at extreme risk to our people. People died this summer, and that's terrible. I can't accept that. We have to learn how to live with fire and create resilient communities, and that's fantastic. Some of the toughest days out there were meeting with the ranching community and facing the impacts that they were feeling, their livelihoods. It was very real, and we spent a lot of time working with that ranching community in Logan Lake because it's such a big part of who we are here too. So, big thanks to, Margaret and Sarah, Doug and Rachel. As you're looking at policy and changes, I think it's critical that we're looking at policy that's going to, get us to that next level. So what's next? Here's my opportunity to put my psychic pants on. Thanks for that one, Margaret. Obviously we're going to have to salvage some of our timber. We're going to focus on the Chief Forester's guidelines and the Skeetchison guidelines. And some of our community input. We're not going to ignore that, but we also want to have a common sense lens to this too. We talked about OGMA in the last session. A whole bunch of our OGMAs have been completely wiped out. I don't think, putting OGMAs in a fence is very effective. And now we've lost everything we're trying to protect. So there's more conversations on that too. We're going to go on site with our stakeholders here. We were out with the Highland Valley Outdoor Association. We need to really walk the talk, if we will, and it's local voices, local choices for us. We're bringing out experts to help our crew understand the impacts. This is for those up in Williams Lake. This is Ken Day, and he's out with our staff just training us on what to look for after a fire. He's been through this in Williams Lake, so lots of expertise. We don't know all the answers, so we're out there actively looking for it. Practitioners coming together. This is huge. What a wonderful opportunity 2021's given us to learn from each other. A community of practice is deeply needed. We need qualified practitioners. We need competency, training, experience, and agreed upon standards. So I'm excited to be, a part of that. And I know, so many people are interested in this, and I can't wait to more of those conversations. Also deepening our understanding, UBC faculty and researchers out there. We've had good collaboration and working with them, great relationship over the years. They've come out to resample their plots over Thanksgiving. Of course, it snowed on them. It's now melted. And I see, I think I saw Ariel and Kea in the attendee list. So shout out to them. Hi, and thanks for all your service on our community forest. We're going to continue to do education to our schools. And we also do a youth Firesmart program. This to me is our succession planning, much like the other First Nation community forests. We're looking at the long game. How do we get our next community forest manager? And it'd be amazing to get them through this program. So this is our crew from this year, 5 14-year-olds, a 15, 16, and a 17-year-old. So our youngest crew ever, but they were fantastic. And they came back after they were evacuated and completed their work. So it was pretty good dedication to, what they're doing there for us. And the last thing we're looking for is leadership and role models. And so when Minister Conroy came to town, it was another opportunity to introduce her to some youth. That's my daughter. And, I think that, when we have strong leadership at all levels and we can create some new policy, that's really going to move us forward and create resilient communities. So come for a tour. 2019, I had my granddaughter was just born. So there she is now. There's the update. I snuck away for 10 minutes during the wildfire. And that's how much time I had with her. So we can learn together. So Cooks John.
Thank you, Garnet. What an inspirational presentation. I think we were all watching different communities being affected by fire, and it's great to see a little bit behind the scenes of what has been going on in Logan Lake. I think it's really telling, as you say, 18 years to be an overnight success. And I know living in a small town surrounded by forests, I'm contacting you to learn more about it. So thank you. Just over the hill from me is the Slocan Community Forest. Tom Bradley has been with CIFCO from the beginning. Tom, fingers crossed, hoping you've sorted out your technical problems. I hear you giggling.
Good.
I'd love to hear you giggle. Tell us about what it was like in Woodlot and the Trozo fire.
Oh, thank you. I gather I'm actually communicating.
Two thumbs up.
Okay, super. Well, thanks for having me. And John has introduced me. And I shall now move to the share screen PowerPoint world. Okay. Our local fire N51705 and our story. I'm taking a slightly different tack than Garnet did. He had a lot of broad vision there. I'm approaching it from the perspective of we're a small community forest and we wake up one day and we're having a fire. And this is our experience of being a small community forest with a significant fire. And let's just be upfront. Compared to some other places, we didn't have a bad year. It was still pretty exciting. So I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Indigenous people within whose traditional lands we are meeting today and get into the meat of it. I got 15 minutes, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. We noticed there was a fire in around July 9th. Here's our community forest within the province. We're in the south. And within our community forest, the fire was kind of central in a south block of the CFA. Okay, there's an ignition. 2 days later, it was going pretty well. There was a mushroom cloud on the horizon. Still, it was just a fire. And now some maps. July 13th, we had 2 fires. Wildfire Service has said, don't worry, they won't be lonely long. And sure enough, they joined up. And, it was spreading around the ridge crests and high country. And then we had a wind event. And in a day and a bit, it went on quite a run, quite a distance to the north. And it was burning hot. That's some of the end of the run, crown fire, dry site, steep slopes. It was a good one. And then it kind of swelled in all directions, except down to the west and downhill towards the community by and large. So by the end of September, you can see that's pretty much our final perimeter. From a start in a cut block in Trozo Creek, all the way to some other parts of the CFA and a whole bunch of adjoining tenures. So within the CFA, though, let's be upfront. There was a lot of high elevation fire, open forests with a lot of pine beetle kill from the 2005-6 epidemic that was nice and dry and jackstrawed and burned very well. Non-forested ridge crests, it rambled around through the high country. It certainly burned some lower country. This is Trozo Creek itself, the upper portion thereof, a large domestic watershed, lots of impact on forests in there. The water users have so far experienced black water. The first rain after the fire was about an inch in a day and a half. That washed a lot of fine black material, char and ash, into the water courses, so they had black water. Next, when that stopped, they had brown water because small landslides and just general surface erosion had begun. Everyone wonders what the freshet will be like. Equivalent clear-cut area? We haven't got there yet by any stretch of the imagination. It's all on my plate, and I'm too busy to get to it at the moment. This was an interface fire. It got quite close to houses on the northwest flank. One of those houses is the house of the community forest manager. That was an exciting period, and we were especially concerned because if the fire had have managed to move a bit further downhill, it starts to achieve a wrap around the ridge and the potential of a significant run to the south and west, which is infrastructure, values at risk, houses, etc. So that was a flank that had everyone's attention. So what was this like as a community forest? Well, all work on the tenure stopped for months. We did nothing that we had planned in 2021. The area exclusion was, of course, perfectly justifiable, and we could get permission to go to work on a day-by-day basis at a specific site for some specific hours, but it's just not practical for real forestry work, and we barely tried. Our logging contractor was working at the bottom of Trozo Creek when the fire started. On about day 3, the machines went up the road and commenced work on fire situations and then rehab. He got back October 11th. So a 3-month gap in harvesting. To say we appreciate the fact he went up the road and went to work on the fire is an understatement, but this is just, we're a small forest. This is one of the impacts. And we, the 3 people who work at CIFCO, well, not even full-time, but a lot of our working career, worked on the fire. Community Forest Manager, Stefan Martineau, interface with BC Wildfire Services, strategic planning work with the incident commander, and Stefan was also one of the evacuees, so his life was turned upside down, and he was dealing with that and a lot of other pressures and the fire all simultaneously. He seems good at this stuff, but I know it was stressful for him. Me, I spent time as a machine crew supervisor, which I wasn't expecting to do, but I got asked to do it because, as you know, it was a busy year and they needed help. I was doing mapping for the incident commander on the night shift, and planning a mapping support for fire guard location on kind of the morning shift. So 12 to 14 hour days for a bunch of weeks. I was happy to help, although by the end I was getting a little tired. Jesper, Man of Steel, our layout and planning forester, he was doing guard location in the weather. It was stupidly hot. There's no water on the slopes, endless horizontal pine and things on fire, sometimes a bit close. He was just having a lovely time, but we owe him a lot and thanked so much for his work on this. So what does it mean that we did fire guard planning and location? Well, most mornings, many mornings, Jesper and I gathered here in front of all my screens with LiDAR, Google Earth, my 40 years of experience on this land base, taking where do we want to try to put a guard? Where can we possibly make one? Coming up with a plan, and then Jesper goes forth with his iPad and the map and locates guard. Next day, we repeat. And a special shout out to Kolesnikov and BCTS, who graciously shared their LiDAR data for areas adjacent to the CFA, just quietly shipped it over. Big help. Typical map for Jesper. Green's not so steep, it's flattish. And as we both came to be giggling about, yep, the whole game is avoid the purple. I actually did this guard from the lake over myself. It's hellish country. It's flat and covered in dead pine. and not a drop of water to be had once you leave Little Swamp. The work mattered. This is a fire guard along the Elliott Ridge. BC Wildfire Service stopped the fire progress along this section of guard. There's nothing downhill towards us where you can put a guard until you're in people's backyards if you don't stop it there. So it was, I gather, a significant effort. It didn't just quietly lie down when I got to the guard, but thank God we got the guard built in time and they stopped the fire, because that was one of the places where the next stop was values at risk. And finally, after the fire was subdued by expertise, air power, hard work, and rain, we woke up the next day to discover that guard salvage was on. The wood that was cut for the guards, salvage work. Again, nothing that was foreseen as what we were doing, 6 weeks of that. So again, 2021 just vanished for this CFA. We did other stuff. Question comes up. Well, the interaction between fire and the fuel managed areas that Garnet was just speaking of. We had very little of that because the fire neatly avoided most of our fuel managed areas because it started pretty high up a drainage and was a high altitude fire. However, there was a small area where our fuel treated area was used, just as in Logan Lake, as the base for a backburn. And this was a mission critical backburn because that was the road slope that the fire really had to be stopped at if it wasn't going to wrap down and into community and valleys at risk. It worked. Wildfire Service also said the presence of significantly large prescribed burn areas with reduced fuels on the flanks of the fire was of great interest and value to them. If they needed them, they could do effective suppression and aerial suppression within those areas. Thankfully, we never needed them. So we didn't get much of a test, and basically we're happy that we didn't get much of a test because the fire weather and fuel conditions were atrocious at the time and things were burning pretty hot. What worked? The incident commander and the suppression crews, great people. We're so grateful to them. Nothing but praise and thanks from us. You know, just a superb job. Not everything worked. Let's be honest. It was a long fire, but the superb effort and the dedication and the professionalism just astonished us. Great people. We had a previous relationship with BC Wildfire Service. We built up over multiple prescribed burns we've done. So we're used to teamwork with BCWS, and it wasn't our first date. So we approached this as a joint exercise. They did too. CIFCO took a role as an information provider. We weren't creating content. That's not our job, and we don't speak for other organizations. We were helping the community find the content information they wanted. We got a lot of positive feedback for doing that work. Good fortune. We didn't get a second wind event for weeks. I mean, we're sitting down here waiting for the wind from the north, which will precipitate the evacuation and the disaster. Never happened. We never got a second ignition nearby, thank God, because it wouldn't take much. One mistake, one car on fire, one house fire, a lightning strike. There were no more resources. If we got a second ignition, we were splitting resources. Never happened. We had suppression success when there had to be suppression success. We always want suppression success, but in a couple of key situations where failure wasn't a pretty sight, we had success. And probably the weird one was the fire sat in the bottom of Winlaw Creek, crawled down there and sat there and did nothing for weeks. We were almost running book on, you think it's going to go west to the silica mine? No, it's going to cross the creek and go up that timber slope like you wouldn't believe. Nothing happened. So that would have been a huge challenge to have a very active second front, and it was a quiet front. So we had a lot of good luck. What did not work? The RDCK established an evacuation zone. Logical thing to do. The command center for the fire was above the exclusion line. The RDCK security would not let me deliver maps. They stopped scheduled meetings between the CFA manager and the incident commander. Obviously, we tried to get that changed. I don't think we were successful. In the end, Jesper said, wear a high vis and put cork boots on your seat to let you through. That worked. And the incident commander and Stefan took up meeting at another location. Fire guard salvage, we've learned that's a good way to lose money in our terrain and timber types. The wood on those fire guards is not necessarily desirable, and the skid can be a rather long uphill one. Post-fire rehab. This has turned into an issue. The fire suppression activity opened up a lot of old roads for access that were brushed in, not very passable, but people did use them. After the road's been opened, Wildfire Services pays to have it rehabilitated to reduce risk. It's rendering those roads impassable, huge cross ditches and general uglification. There's an unusually broad community consensus afoot. Not very happy people about the change. We don't have a solution. We're aware of the laws. Question of roads already been mentioned at this meeting. It's a much bigger situation, but it has rubbed a lot of people's fur the wrong way. And we learned about access. We had a lot of very old blocked access into the active fire area. The time required to reopen that old access, which predates the community forest by decades, was not a help. We were opening road when we wanted to be at the end of it building guard. So takeaways from the experience, access is vital. We already knew this, but it rubbed it in as to what a problem it is when you have no working access. Creating a pre-plan for those non-status roads and other roads is very difficult. There's tremendous difference of opinion on there should be a road, there shouldn't be a road, it should be in this condition, there's legal implications, etc. What we have found is trying to react to the opening of the roads and coming up with this alleged plan in the window between the end of the fire and snowfall is completely impossible. With hindsight, we would have liked to have had more thought into this realm. Highly recommend it to other CFAs to turn your minds to what would be the desired future condition if your roads suddenly were reopened and were now being rehabbed and put to bed. And fuel management is a good thing. Thank you, Wildfire Branch. UBCM, FESBC, and Columbia Basin Trust funded much of the fuel management work that we've carried out. And if you'd like to know more or watch some very nice videos prepared by our videographer, Rachel, visit us at cifco.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I've had the pleasure to know and work with you for decades, and I love your perspective on things. I made note of one of the things you said, that the whole game is to avoid the purple. You and Jesper were, of course, looking at the LiDAR and the slope map, but it made me think of Tony's slide talking about temperature, because I think that's also a different purple that we need to avoid. So maybe that's the theme of our presentation.
Avoid the purple.
So far. It's great to hear from you and Garnet about what it is like within a community forest, within a community, when you're surrounded by fire. It's so interesting. I probably speak for everybody. I really wish that we weren't doing this on a screen, and that after this presentation we could congregate in the hall or go outside and talk more about this, because it is so relevant and so interesting.
I know that I could talk more, and I'm sure Garnet could too, but 15 minutes, we tried to home it down. So thank you for that, and been great.
Yeah. And we are in a Zoom room. We are, of course, watching the clock. He says, pointing at the other speakers and their time availability. Let's hand it off to Chris Hodder. Chris, we've heard some really interesting perspectives locally. I think people will be really interested to learn what you and your group take away from this and what your plans are. So Chris Hodder.
Yeah, no, thanks there, John. And what a great narrative and experiences there. Thanks for Garnet and Tom. And look there, Garnet, you looked a little bit comfortable, a bit too comfortable in the reds and blues. That might be another calling there for you there, Garnet. So we probably should connect. Kelly is just going to bring up the slide deck. We're going to be doing a bit of a tag team. what I'm sort of going to start off with is just a bit of a brief sort of snapshot in history. Just go through the next slide there, Kelly. And we're going to sort of see, where we see some changes and shift and focuses in our approach when it comes to wildfire suppression, wildfire protection, and wildfire sort of resiliency. But I also want to really acknowledge, wildfire has been part of Canada's landscape, BC's landscapes. It's evolved a landscape and used by the Indigenous people and First Nations well and truly long before colonialism arrived. And I think that's a really important aspect that we need to sort of keep in mind. But I just want, for this sort of slide, I just want to go through the last sort of 100 odd years, and you can see this sort of transition. It's really sort of interesting. And I think it complements what Tony was sort of presenting and sort of feeds off what Garnet and Tom sort of experiences. And I'm going to work from sort of left to right, so starting with the aspect.
Why is it not?
If we looked at the early 1900s, there's a Royal Commission in there, and it was very sort of focused on forest fire suppression and prevention. And I think you can probably sort of confidently say that that led for several decades, and probably to a certain degree up to now as well. But it was really forestry sort of centric. By the mid 1900s, another sort of commission report came in there, still looking at still very sort of prevention suppression focused, but we started to see a slight shift about land-based management, but still very forestry sort of centric. And moving on sort of along the blue line, in sort of 1994, 1993, the mid sort of 90s, there was a bit of a shift. We had the Garnet Fire, and probably a few of the people in this call may have been involved in that. That was a real big sort of shift to sort of, okay, towards public safety and looking at our partnerships with local governments and First Nations. And then a little bit further down there, we had the Kelowna Fires, the Filman Report. That was probably the first real significant fire where we saw large sort of scale destruction and interruptions on communities and economic impacts. And then, sad to say, from there, we've just sort of escalated in relation to into more sort of interface fires, more fires impacting on the interface within the Wilwi. And since then, we really haven't sort of looked back. But the big shift has gone through to public safety, all government response, wildfire resiliency, and climate change adaptation. Thanks, Hekel. Just next slide. So where we are today, we certainly continue to listen. Really important aspect as part of that learning journey, being able to change, and we have to be able to adapt. And I think certainly the last 5 years, which is not uncommon in other jurisdictions, we get forced into this space because of natural disasters. And the last 5 years, which we've all experienced from 17, 18, and this year's fire seasons, really has sort of demonstrated that our previous approaches to wildfire risk reduction and wildfire resiliency were not broad enough to really be able to reduce the wildfire risk or increase the ability for our communities to withstand and respond back from wildfires. So when we have these large events, and there's no surprise there, but when we have these large events, we do a number of reviews. We have external reviews like the fire and flood sort of review by the Chapman. We do our own internal sort of reviews and our debriefs, after action reviews, and we really have a look at how that sort of influences into our current state. And there was no difference in that in 17 where we had that review. From those reviews, from the feedback we get in from partners, from the community, from the public, from our staff, from our partner agencies, we learn lots from them. And that was no different from 17. And some of the things that we heard through the reviews, communities and partners felt that limitations of progress, that was lacking funding, and the impact on workload was too much. Program requirements and the roles of the relevant organisation create confusion for the communities and for our partners. It really needed a more coordinated approach when we talk about wildfire resiliency, wildfire prevention and risk reduction. So we need a more sort of inclusive and more coordinated approach. The funding applications, and you might remember the days of swiping, and even still, I think there's some improvements we can do on the current one, that the applications were cumbersome. They were sort of exclusive. They actually, the programs excluded really important partners. It was administratively burdened. We also heard that Firesmart needed to be more incorporated and embedded into our prevention program. And I'm sure that this will come up as sustainable sort of funding. So we heard lots, and which really shapes where we are today. And I think, and Tony touched on it, but there's also these emerging influences that really sort of help us to continue in the evolution of wildfire sort of resiliency. We mentioned, the changes of FERPA, and there were some announcements earlier, I think today or yesterday. We have the Modernisation Emergency Program Act, and Tony mentioned the Climate Adaptation Strategy and DRIPA. So all these really have a big influence in what and how we are currently structured today. Do you want to move on to the next one there? So this one, this slide here, this gives us a bit of a snapshot where we are, and with the Community Resiliency Investment Program. And this was really derived from the 17 Fire and Flood Review, where we really was the replacement of what SWIPE, which was the Strategic Wildfire Prevention Initiative, which was established since 2004 to all the way through 2017. So it had a long program, but had lots of flaws to it. So there's a number of aspects in relation to the Community Investment Program. I'm going to talk about two. There is a third one, but it's really, and I think Jennifer will touch a bit of base on through the economic recovery stimulus one, which would provide an opportunity. But I'm going to really focus on these two ones. The economic recovery was very much a one-time initiative basis, but I'll talk about these ones. So we've got really two programs, and the idea of that really is reducing wildfire risk on the community as well as on the landscape, acknowledging the importance of the two. The two go hand in hand. And we've got two sort of main programs, and the audience will be familiar with the Firesmart community funding category, which is administered by UBCM. That's really sort of local government community focus based initiative funding for wildfire resiliency and risk reduction. Really, that is based on and a lot of the prevention program that we do base this on is on our Firesmart's principles. We've got some really good, strong partnerships to help us administer that program. We have UBCM, Finesse, FESBC, and ourselves, but that's also attached to the BC Firesmart Committee. The other aspect, the other part of the stream is the Crownland Wildfire Risk Reduction, and this in itself is a significant shift for the ministry. This is where we, the ministry, really internalised wildfire risk reduction and embedded into part of our business, part of our program. So that is a significant shift internally for us. And with any sort of change, there are some challenges with that. Now, there's a bit of a gap there and a bit of a question mark. And that question mark there is, I think that leads into the next slide there, is really some of the opportunity that sort of exists, and just acknowledging that industry, particularly, and Kelly mentioned early on with the Bccfa, how important and logical partners in wildfire resiliency and wildfire risk reduction comes in there. So this, before I hand it over to Kelly, this is where I think where we're going to be leading for the future. And this is where certainly I would like to be able to move to the future. We acknowledge that we can't do this on our own, and I don't think we should or don't really want to do this on our own. We can't sort of underestimate the importance of the partnerships when it comes down to wildfire resiliency, wildfire risk reduction. And really the success, and I think this was highlighted through Garnett's and Tom's presentation, that really is dependent on collaboration, it's dependent on relationships and partnerships that are established at all levels. The relationship I have with Jennifer at a provincial level to the local relationships that happen out on the ground. But there's some key ingredients that we have here. So certainly I think we'll be stronger together by involving everyone in this. Not only do the groups who are able to participate, but the landscape it sort of also covers. And that supports that wildfire risk, wildfire resiliency aspect of it, both at a community and landscape aspect. Working with our partners, working with our staff, working with communities and developing and implementing programs through building programs through trusting and relationships at all levels, very much a co-development approach. Again, like I said, we can't do this on our own. Then if I have a look at the integration piece, I'm not talking about business or organizational integration. It's more about planning. It's more about our preparedness. It's about our response. Ensuring that our communities and partners aren't disadvantaged or in isolation or have been isolated. So certainly that's what I would refer to, that integration piece. The commitment, and this may sort of come up in further discussion, and certainly aware of on front and center of my mind, is that providing a level of certainty and stability and sustainability when it comes into these sort of programs. Partners and communities, they're not able to invest in long-term programs if these programs are short-lived, like initiative funding, or 1 year or 2 years. So we really understand that we need to be able, for people to be able to invest long-term with a high level of confidence, we need to have a high level of commitment to this. And then finally, it's about partnerships. For me, it's about working together. It's about shared responsibility. And I think I'll stop there, and I'll hand that over to Kelly for the remainder of our presentation there.
Thank you. I'm not going to spend too much time on just a couple of these slides. Obviously, Chris mentioned each one of our different streams under the Community Resiliency Investment Program has a primary focus, has different partnerships and some different goals, but they are meant to come together to meet sort of that vision of underneath the 7 Firesmart disciplines. And so while we may be focusing under the Crown Land wildfire risk reduction, primarily on planning for and implementing field management treatments, including prescribed fire, on provincial Crown land, we certainly want to build a process and are working hard with all of our various partners to have that linked into the Firesmart community funding and supports program category, which also does field management on Indigenous First Nations reserves, municipal or regionally owned parks, and sometimes just because of the way the land base is spread out, there's often little parcels of provincial Crown land within a municipal boundary. So we're trying to come up with a program approach or a program solution that really is driven by threat, and I've got some maps to kind of show that, but also, pulls in the right people at the right time to either deliver a particular activity where there's a strong skill set, for example, the community forest managers and field management, but also supporting the communities in areas where they might need to be focusing, like development permit areas, for example. Firesmart private land and the Firesmart grant. So it is really a larger vision, but sort of like the big chess piece, trying to bring those pieces together. And I think what Chris is alluding to is we don't have all the answers on how those pieces should come together. We do have a pretty strong vision in the Firesmart committee and sort of driving it, but how do we work with our partners to help us kind of design underneath that, bringing the chess pieces together. And then, as Chris alluded to, we do have that economic recovery initiative, and Jennifer will really talk on some of the great things that we've been able to achieve through that, and then where we may be moving in the future. Again, most people, I think, are aware that the Crown Land Program is field management planning and treatment activities, does certainly includes prescribed fire, and anybody who was paying attention to some of the media and conversations this summer, there's definitely a renewed and intensified focus on prescribed fire within British Columbia and within for the BC Wildfire Service. And obviously that critical infrastructure piece that we're focusing on as well. Critical infrastructure is often embedded within the community, which is obviously why we really focus on the wildland urban interface. But obviously, recognizing that there is isolated critical infrastructure on the landscape as well. So as Chris said, our driving focus is obviously predominantly, and this can include thinking about how we manage the forest at a landscape level from a human life and safety perspective. So we do want to reduce fire behavior, so it's safer and easier. And I think Garnet talked a lot about a real life example for the firefighters to suppress wildfires and also to help mitigate negative impacts to communities at risk in the wildland urban interface. But part of that, the other part of that is, sorry, Teams is crazy, I can't turn it on. The other piece of that is ensuring that we're also educating the public that the fuel breaks that we invest and are not are not going to sort of quote unquote save the day without that additional Firesmart focus, and the onus is on everybody from the individual citizen or homeowner to the local governments and the provincial and obviously the federal government on that piece. So as I said, that's what really drives when we're thinking about designing the Firesmart Community Funding Supports program or updating the guides, as well as looking at the Crown Land wildfire risk reduction opportunities. What's a priority? What's the criteria? Initially, our criteria and mandate is definitely driven wherever we invest on the land base. It is still primarily for a human life and safety perspective. Underneath that. So, and I think this year was a prime example of those, landscape level wildfire runs, where, we do want to maybe change our thinking a little bit, work with some of our partners, and what does that look like? Certainly the interface, and it proved itself, field breaks in the interface, working adjacent from the communities out this year, certainly played a part in mitigating negative impacts. So we don't want to abandon that approach. It's still our primary priority, but also looking at, secondary zoning or something to the effect of, what do you do from the 2K to the 10K, for example. And then obviously resiliency plays into that. So you can have a wildfire risk reduction landscape level focus that may, focus on reducing fire behaviors that's kind of driving towards a community, but also designing that to also be resilient. So obviously, based on this year, the number, and I think we're up to 60,000 hectares that were identified within a fire perimeter in the wildland urban interface this year. It's easy for people to understand that, sometimes our focus as a response agency will be on the WUI sort of. And so how do we think about our forest management practices, as well as our potential opportunities, larger prescribed fire, et cetera, because of that sort of struggle between the interface impacts and the landscape impacts, and the interface, will continue to sort of be the focus for the human life and safety perspective. So what does that look like? This is a big messy map, but I did want to take a look at, obviously the community forest areas are in blue. The wildland urban interface with kind of the PSTA is the multicolored circles out to kind of the 2K. And then the fires, the bright red fires, are the current 2021 perimeters, and then the pink outlines are sort of the 2017 to 2021. So I'm very much a visual person, and I spend my day looking at this, and then I think, well, if I look at this situation, how would I design or build a partnership, kind of understanding the relationship between the last 4 years of fire perimeters, where the interface risk is, what that risk looks like, where are the community forests located now, what might be priorities for community forests from our perspective, from a threat perspective, in the future. So there's a story, well, there's many stories to be told actually within here. But those are some of the things when we're looking at that, how we apply risk mitigation at multiple scales. These are some of the factors that are in our mind. So you can see in this map, obviously there's community forests that were impacted by fires this year. You can also see there's areas of the province where there's significant amount of continuous wildland urban interface, but not a lot of community forests. So, from our perspective, obviously that is still going, whether it's in a community forest or not, if it's a high risk WUI, that's going to be our priority moving forward. But how do we work with all of our varied partners to be able to maximize the opportunities where there are, local community tenures at the same time? So, and I just got another one, I think, kind of up in the, had some of those larger, the 2017 fires. So big landscape impacts up here. Obviously, there's a lot of high risk if you look at our new mapping, which is available, the 2021 provincial strategic threat, and all this mapping has been updated. There's some large risk here. So again, if we're thinking about how do we manage the landscape risk, what role do these older fires play? We've got an area like here where there's no community forest, but there's definitely some risk. So as I said, it's just kind of, from my level or my perspective, looking at that provincial level, but then chunking it out. And certainly when I build the interface or I look at maps like this, I'm driven by threat and risk mitigation first, and then I sort of look at the tenures after. So as we all know, fire is, and there's a really prime example here, fire is jurisdictionally blind. And so the threat reduction initially needs to be jurisdictionally blind, but then we look obviously at those jurisdiction opportunities and where there's that potential to marry. And a really prime example here, and then I think I'm almost done, is when you're looking at this Vernon fire, you had I believe there was a complex here of 3 different regional district areas and the Penticton Indian Band, and then Vernon. So even, and even in the response when you're trying to find information on sort of the different evacuation orders, et cetera, there's some interesting jurisdictional ways and means in British Columbia as we move forward. And so that's a different conversation for another day, but certainly in my mind, as you can see, the fire doesn't really pay attention to those. It does what it wants to do, and it's obviously driven by food. And so what does that mean for this group? Where are the places that we can provide that space for the community forest members and the communities and the, stakeholders, the wildfire service practitioners locally to come together and talk about, take one of these areas here, this kind of bubble of threat in here. There's various players, and so we've created, I'm trying to make this Community Firesmart Resiliency Committee, for those that can't see that. So the Community Firesmart Resiliency Committee is an activity that we fund through the Firesmart Community Funding and Supports Program. We really believe in the philosophy of Firesmart is locally owned, locally supported, locally driven. And so we certainly want to support communities, First Nations, et cetera, to be able to be owners and drivers of these resiliency committees. And then they, look at your members. They can be scalable, as I mentioned, sort of locally thinking with different groups of stakeholders. It's preferable that we don't have sort of one resiliency committee per every tiny community or tiny area, because as I said, there's probably 4 different jurisdictions within this bubble. And so how do the local areas want to self-organize in a way that's going to be efficient and effective, but also enable, fuel breaks to be built at the scale to manage the fires at this scale, for example. So again, it's really a place where, there could be a role for community forest agreement holders, either maybe to support the community and being the body that does some of the work in the organization, which we would certainly fund through the community grant, but also to be present and talk about, the field management or the forest management potential opportunities within there. As I said, it's definitely scalable. We do fund 100% through that program of setting up the meetings, we have draft terms of reference, we have all sorts of support to be able to do that. And then obviously, it is back to Chris's point, it's really to help promote that partnership and collaboration for all things sort of wildfire risk reduction or, under the Firesmart 7 disciplines, but you can also, hypothetically split off a field management planning table underneath here. But again, having the communities really own and be part of that, building that vision, which I think will help enable the buy-in when we're coming to do the field management treatments that, everybody's kind of been brought along through the process, and, obviously including partnerships with Indigenous communities. So that's pretty much where I landed, and I'm not sure if we're doing questions now or we're carrying on, so I'll just go back to that one. John, I think Lori's up still.
That's great. Kelly, thanks so much to you and Chris to give us such important detail about the province's direction on this. Jen Gunter, those maps I think really pointed to the WUI and to communities. Let's hear about the BCCFA perspective on this.
Okay, John, thanks so much. Now, are you able to see my presentation slide?
Yes, looks really good.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone, John and all the panelists for this overview, the stories of what happened this summer. It's just, it's incredibly powerful. The BCCFA has been working for years to support and advance the role of community forests in working in wildfire management. And back to the Abbott-Chapman report, they actually recommended that we put more community forests in the interface around communities so that we can help facilitate this important work. We now have 60 community forests in the province, and the majority of those are involved in proactive management of wildfire. This map is on the BCCFA website if you want to take a look at a higher resolution version. So like I say, the association's been advocating for, enhancing the role of community forest in this work. And I think that with the examples that we have heard today of Logan Lake and the Slocan Valley, it's happening and there's still work to be done. I think that the fire seasons that we've had in the last 5 years and our knowledge of this proactive work that community forests are doing is really strengthening our resolve to carry on and to promote community forests, both as a tool for community economic development, but also for helping to mitigate environmental disasters like wildfires. We've got good evidence of the proactive work. We survey our members every year on 18 indicators, and wildfire management is one of them. Our latest indicators report was just published in September. It's on our website, and I encourage those that haven't gone through it to download a copy and have a read. Indicator number 13 is the one that gathers data on proactive wildfire management. I think what we've seen, we heard from Garnet, it took 18 years to be an overnight success. So community forests have been demonstrating this leadership for a lot of years. They really see the urgency of the problem, and they're making investments. And I'm not sure if this came through in those presentations, but what we see is that community forests are making investments from their own funds, their own revenues, and then they're also, as the presenters mentioned, able to leverage funds from provincial sources. And we see that there's been a variety of those different sources in the last few years. The partnership that the Bccfa and BC Wildfire Service has been developing goes back a few years. It was really, I would say, after the 2017 fire season and the after action review that we saw significant advancements in trying to establish better communication and collaboration. One of the first steps was developing an engagement agreement between BC Wildfire Service, the Bccfa, and also the Woodlot Federation. And you'll see here just the cover page of that agreement. And the purpose is to provide the basis from which BC Wildfire Service, Woodlot licensees, and community forest agreement holders can build and improve their working relationships around emergency management, including all 4 pillars. So preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. And I'm happy to share if, I think this is on our website. If not, I'm happy to share copies of this agreement. It's really kind of a template, and it lists the areas where we'd like to see communication and collaboration occurring. So through this time, we were kind of building an improved communication channel between the BCCFA and the BC Wildfire Service. And we were talking about ways to help community forests access provincial funding for wildfire risk reduction. Many community forests were benefiting from the funds that were available through the Forest Enhancement Society of BC. And with the shift to wildfire risk reduction funding being delivered through BC Wildfire Service, we wanted to figure out how to make sure that community forests would have access. So then the pandemic hit when we were having these conversations, and the provincial government, a few months later, announced the pandemic economic recovery funding through BC's economic recovery plan. And early on, we were really pleased to see that job creation in wildfire risk reduction was among the planned investments. So we got to work really quickly with BC Wildfire Service then to figure out how community forests could play a role and how we could get some of that funding on the ground in community forests as quickly as possible. So we signed an agreement with BC Wildfire Service in October of 2020 and got to work really fast developing a program guide and eligibility and evaluation criteria for projects. So the Economic Recovery Initiative, as Chris mentioned, was one-time funding, and it was designed to create jobs and stimulate economic activity and also help community forests with the wildfire hazard. We sent out a call for proposals to all community forests later that month. And I want to express my gratitude to everyone that responded. It was a really quick turnaround. And so we thank you for just stepping up and pulling together project proposals. As I say, we were kind of building the plane as it was heading down the runway. But we were quickly able to assemble a management committee and an evaluation committee, which included the expertise of Gord Pratt from the Forest Enhancement Society of BC, along with reps from BC Wildfire Service and the association. And together, we were able to successfully approve 44 projects in 15 community forests, totaling $5 million. So these projects are underway now. Of course, with the fire season that we had and other mitigating circumstances, some of them are just getting started, but work is underway. And most of the projects will be completed by March of 2022. So even though this has been a one-time opportunity for us to fund these projects through the Bccfa directly, what I'm hoping is that we can learn from this work, and that as the projects are implemented and near completion, that this whole experience is going to really help us inform what a long-term partnership should look like. So we're going to be doing site visits next spring and telling stories of these community forests and what their experience has been through these projects. BC Wildfire Service is also looking at some case studies from this fire season and where fires interacted with treatment areas. And as you're going to hear in a moment, we're also really excited to learn the results of research that Dr. Lori Daniels and her team are conducting on the efficacy of treatments. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks so much for the chance to talk about the work of the BCCFA here. As I say, I think that all of this is really helping to inform our ongoing discussions with BC Wildfire Service and what the future of our partnership can and should look like. So thanks, John.
Thank you, Jen. Really informative and great work that you and your organization are doing. I'm seeing the questions in the chat. As these things often go, we are a little bit behind our schedule, but we've truly left the best for last. Lori, I don't think we've ever met, but I have to say I'm one of your biggest fans. I love hearing you on the radio and reading the work that you do, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation on what the science is telling us about what we in communities can do about the risk of wildfire.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for that nice introduction. I wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh here at the University of British Columbia. I also want to note that I am representing a large team of really fantastic graduate students, undergraduate assistants, and postdoctoral researchers who have been working with me on these questions and collaborating with the Community Forest Association, with BC Wildfire Service, and with Wildfire Canada through this network of funding agencies and granting opportunities that have allowed us really to delve into understanding how fire has worked in the past, to understand historical fire regimes and how they are changing, and then to use that information that we can garner about the past to help guide our proactive future towards resilient communities and forests in the context of wildfire and climate change. We've already touched on and heard spectacular accounts about this fire season. And I put this slide together really early on in the fire season, reflecting on how 2021 was looking so much like 2017 and 2018. And so the pop quiz was to compare and contrast the fire danger maps. As you can see, they're all bright red and orange, extreme and high fire danger throughout the province, some pockets of moderate, and the urgency towards preventing any ignitions that were accidental or human caused was so paramount. The contrast or the difference is the two on the left were for the middle of, or for August, the middle of our fire season. Whereas here we were at the end of June facing that heat dome and the unprecedented temperatures across the province that we've heard about. And then yet again, a fire season just about to begin. A theme that I have spoken about, and you may have heard me speak about in other conferences, is also not only the role of climate change in these extreme fire weather events, But this legacy of 100 years of settlement, of land use, and of fire suppression or fire management across the province has really altered the way our forests function, the structure and composition, and ultimately the fuel loads as well. So an important theme, and the first thing I wanted to touch on in the presentation today, is to share with you some recent findings about how we have used tree rings to understand how fire regimes have been disrupted in our dry forests in particular, and how this relates to the fire suppression paradox. So you can see in the picture here an open ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forest that we think historically was maintained by surface fires. And the tree rings that you can see in the backdrop here and the arced scars on them are indicating when fires have burned in the past at short intervals. So high frequency, low intensity fires. Those fires were both a product of lightning ignitions, but we know now, when we're getting deeper understanding of the role of Indigenous fire stewardship, not just in small pockets across the province, but across broad areas of traditional territories where fire was being used to manage land and resources and to protect communities for time immemorial. Our goals to suppress fires, the fire suppression paradox, are our century of altering fire regimes through fire exclusion and more recently active fire suppression that's been very effective, has led to landscape changes that interact with other disturbances like mountain pine beetle and contribute to changes in our fuel structures. And ultimately, we see this confluence, kind of the perfect storm of factors coming together and leading to the mega fires that we've experienced in recent years. I want to share with you research that is hot off the press, and Kelsey is here in the audience with us today. And so I'm so grateful that she allowed me to highlight and really feature the work that she has done in collaboration with the Williams Lake Community Forest and the Williams Lake First Nation, where she has used tree rings to explore the role of fire in the forests around Williams Lake and in the community forest through time. So Kelsey's research used tree rings taken from tree cores that you can see at the top of the picture on the right, and then cross-sectional or partial sections from fire-scarred trees, where she has used tree ring methods to identify and cross-date the rings to assign dates to individual calendar years. And you see a couple of examples of trees that died during the 1900s, but had embedded in their tree rings fire scars that tell us about the exact year and season that fires burned in the past. Kelsey's research area is shown in the map on the left. And this is the flat rock block or the Necestine block of the community forest. And here she had used a gridded pattern where she sampled plots of forest at higher elevation, as well as along the benches of the Fraser River. And we see across those two elevation zones subtle differences in species composition and some forest structures, but also in terms of archaeological sites and human land use over long periods of time. Kelsey has reconstructed this really fantastic fire scar record. So let me explain briefly that the timeline that we're looking at is 1500 on the left through to the present over on the right. Each of those horizontal lines are representing study areas where she's reconstructed historical fires using those tree ring methods, looking at the fire scars, which are indicated in the red and yellow ticks, the reds being the fire scars embedded in the tree rings, supplemental evidence in the yellow ticks. And then the black triangles are showing periods when the tree cores indicated that we had cohorts or pulses of trees that established at approximately the same time. Each of the horizontal lines, as I said, is a different site. And so collectively, they're telling us about how frequently fire burned across this landscape in the past. She identified 83 different fire events between the mid-1500s and 1982. In the entire area, there was one fire burning every 4 years. The median return interval at individual plots was less than 20 years. Fire was incredibly frequent in this landscape in the past. This chart summarizes all of the fires that she observed and reconstructed, and you can see that many of the fires burned only one plot, whereas a subset of them were widespread fires that burned across the study area and were burning more than 25% of her study areas. Now, the cohorts themselves are scattered through time, so we can see them responding to fires or disturbances at individual sites, rather than all establishing at the same time, as you might expect if there was a widespread fire that burned across the whole landscape, or if the cohorts were established primarily because of climate. So that variability tells us about the patchiness of the fires in a mixed severity fire regime of the past. The bottom graph that I've just added shows the ages of the trees, a frequency histogram of the age of trees telling us when they established or when the contemporary forest, when the trees established back in time. And as you can see, the majority of them began to establish after 1850, and in particular after the last widespread fire in 1870. And we've had this influx then of trees that established and then persisted in absence of subsequent surface fires. As the fire scar record shows, surface fires depleted and then became almost non-existent since the 1940s. And so this radical change in the fire regime, frequent fires burning through the landscape and changing the structure of the forest or maintaining low tree densities and maintaining low fuel loads on the surface. When we take away that fire, we're seeing an influx of trees, increased forest density, and more fuel available to burn. You might imagine as well that we've accumulated forest floor and duff and woody debris on the ground. And so this brings me to the second half of what I'd like to speak about today, is in many of our dry forests, we see the repeat pattern that Kelsey's research has shown. We've seen these changes across much of the dry forests, many of the areas where in fact we have the strategic threat map shows us that we have a high risk of fire. We also know these are the areas where surface fires have been excluded and suppressed, and where the forests have changed in ways where the fuels have accumulated to make the potential for high severity fire even more acute than it would have been historically. So these are also areas where we might want to focus our fuels mitigation work in the wildland-urban interface. Now, an ongoing debate and an important question is whether our treatments are actually effective. Are we achieving our goals? And so this is where our collaboration with the community forest has really taken off. We started in phase 1 looking at 4 community forests and collecting some data on how the fires, how the treatments were progressing, and looking at a number of sites in 2019, and then repeating some of our sampling this past summer. We have expanded this study. Kaya Rutherford is a PhD student who has been out working with multiple community forests, collecting data from over 230 sites across the community forest to better understand how the fuel treatments are moving forward. And finally, the third phase, of course, will be ongoing fuels or research on fuels treatments starting next summer. Let me share with you some of our results from phase 1. Our questions really focused on whether or not we are meeting our goals. So we're trying to assess the efficacy of the treatments that are taking place. And when we do fuels treatments, we're looking at reducing, ultimately, we want to reduce fire intensity, reduce the chance of active crown fire, and increase the resilience of the forest. So in the advent of fire, we have greater tree survivorship. We do that by mitigating the fuels, decreasing tree density, in particular in the subcanopy, reducing the surface fuels, and then increasing height to live crown. And so these are the types of treatments, prescriptions that are being implemented across community forests in the province. What we wanted to do was to assess the effects by taking field measurements and using fire behavior models. So here's an example of a research design that we have in collaboration with Logan Lake Community Forest. The different polygons are indicating places. The red polygons are places where treatments had occurred in the past. The orange are the polygons that we heard Garnet talk about earlier, where there are treatments that had begun or were in progress at the time of the fires this summer. What we've done is distributed our plots across the treatment areas, but also in adjacent areas that will not be treated, so that we have controls that we can continue to monitor and to compare the forest structures in control or untreated areas and in treatment areas. And ideally, we would get measurements before and after the treatments take place. And so that was one of our main goals when we did our sampling this summer, was to team up with those community forests that are benefiting from that economic recovery funding, and to get the before treatment data, and to return next summer and in subsequent years after those treatments are complete. So here's a few examples from the community forests of what the untreated forests look like at the top, where we have high density of trees, dead branches coming right down to the ground, and in particular, a high density of subcanopy trees. And you can see the stands at the bottom that have been treated, largely affecting and changing the fuels in ways that were desired. We have gone in and measured both aerial fuels, surface fuels, in terms of vegetation and surface woody fuels, as well as ground fuels. So our aerial fuels use fixed area plots or timber cruise data, and we enhance that by also looking at measurements of height, crown base height, and crown closure. We collect our surface fuel information using line transects along the ground, and then we've been measuring as well the depth of the forest floor and the duff. Okay, once we've collected all that data, it goes into the magical black box of fire behavior modeling. And here I want to acknowledge the tremendous work of Greg Green, who has been working diligently to come up with methods to make sure that we are addressing our questions appropriately. The inputs to our models are simple topography inputs, one component of fire behavior. The second being weather, and we've been working with the 90th percentile in the last 15 years. And so looking at the high degree, the more extreme fire weather conditions, collecting information, both temperature, relative humidity, and rain, the fire weather metrics that are collected and the fire weather indices that are derived from those. And then we've been using the program Wind Ninja to determine fire direction and speeds to build into our modeling. The fuels, again, drawing from our field plots, we're deriving stand densities, basal areas, canopy cover, crown base height is CBH, and then calculating from those the canopy bulk density to represent aerial fuels. The surface fuels, we're focusing on those that are less than 7 centimeters in diameter, plus the forest floor and duff. And here we use that to calculate surface fuel consumption. So we're borrowing from existing fire behavior models in order to make these calculations and represent the fuels and fire effects on them. So here's where the magic occurs. And we end up by drawing from the Crown Fire Initiation and Spread models and the Fire Behavior Prediction System, we've been able to generate outcomes that represent the type of fire, the probability of crown fire, rates of spread of both surface and crown fire components, and then measures of the intensity. And again, drawing from 2 programs that were strongly recommended by BC Wildfire Service as programs that could help us to better understand fire behavior. So the Crown Fire Initiation and Spread model and the Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System. So let me go back and show you some results. I'm pooling the results from Williams Lake, from Logan Lake, and from West Bank First Nation Community Forests to illustrate to you what we have been learning. So we have here 50 plots in untreated forests and another 50 plots, just over 50 plots, that have been treated. And so the first thing I want to point out to you is when we model fire behavior, in the untreated plots, 32 of them would support an active or spreading crown fire, whereas the remainder of plots would be passive crown fire. The treatments reduce that number to about 19% of the plots. So under a fifth of the plots would support crown fire. The rest are passive crown fire, so a surface fire component with the potential for some trees to candle or torch. Our active crown fire, we're looking here at some of the metrics of the forests associated with these different types of forest or fire behaviors. And what I want to point out here is that in the untreated areas, we have very high densities of canopy and especially subcanopy trees that lead to high fuel loads in the canopy. And where we reduce those fuel loads, we reduce the intensity of the fires. And where we've treated them, we can drop both the density of the trees and change the fire behavior very effectively. A second set of metrics, the lower tree density and canopy bulk densities shift us towards passive crown fire, and at the same time maintain canopy for biodiversity. Maintaining some trees in the canopy is important, as many of these areas are also mule deer winter range. In a subset of our treatments, we did find that the subtree canopies remained quite high, which explained why we ended up with active crown fire, even though we had a lower canopy bulk density. Let me move then to the surface fuels. The fuel strata gap tells us about the ladder fuels, and we're down onto the ground here and looking at the different fuel loads. You can see with the treatments, we increase the gap between the ground and the crowns of the trees. We don't change much though, the woody fuels or the forest floor and the duff. The fuel gap, we wanted to increase that through our treatments because it reduces the chance of conducting fire up into the canopies. Changing the forest floor and duff is difficult to impossible to do. We had been concerned that we might increase our woody structures on the ground, and yet our surface fuel loads remained less than 1 kilogram per meter squared. And that tells us that the mitigation effects, the pile burning and the removal of some of that fine wood after the treatment was effective, as we would have increased the amount of fine fuels through the treatments, breaking of branches and the like through the treatment process. The surface fuels are of great concern, and it's one of the key criteria that is assessed by BC Wildfire Service to ensure that treatments are being effective. And so maintaining or reducing those fine woody fuels and the forest floor and duff are goals as we move forward to continue to find ways to effectively reduce them. And I want to point out we have few options. We can either be raking them and trying to reduce them by hand, which is cost effective and probably not very efficient, or we could be expanding our use of prescribed fire that both reduces your surface fuel loads and consumes some of that forest floor and duff that is accumulated in absence of surface fire over many decades and centuries. Lastly, I want to just highlight some of the findings from our fire behavior modeling to point out that the surface fire rates of spread, the intensity of surface fires, and the intensity of crown fires are all affected by the fuels reduction treatments. And in essence, what we're able to do is shift from crown to passive crown fire and slow the rates of spread of the fire, which of course is a goal that we're aiming for in terms of being able to manage fires when they're burning through the landscape and towards the wildland urban interface. We can reduce the amount of crown fire as well, and note that the intensities, even where crown fires are occurring in treated areas, the intensity of those fires are halved compared to the untreated areas in the landscape. As Garnet noted, we have been able to go back and look at some of our plots that we established and measured in Logan Lake in June. They burned in August, and sure enough, kind of reinforcing our understanding that the treatments are working well. Where treatments had not taken place, we observed 100% tree mortality, scorch, and consumption of the crowns, and ground scorch to mineral soil. Whereas where the treatments had taken place, we saw lower fire intensity and lower fire effects as a result. So my take-home messages: our contemporary megafires are being driven by climate change, but they also reflect the legacies of a century of landscape change. The accumulation of fuels, especially in our dry forests, are an unintended consequence of our very successful fire suppression of the past. Now, knowing that, it allows us to understand how we can undo that effect. And we can do that through our treatments that are proving effective for reducing aerial and surface fuels, measurements we're able to verify. And then using fire behavior modeling, we can support the efficacy of the treatments and then also compare them to post-fire observations. There are still some challenges and limitations to our current modeling approaches. This is an ongoing area of research for us. But overall, I do want to reiterate that we are finding here in British Columbia strong support, empirical support for the proactive fuel treatments and the management of our dry forests in the goal to achieve resilience to wildfire and climate change. It's been a pleasure working with the Community Forest Association and collaborating with BC Wildfire Service and many other agencies in BC and beyond. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Lori. What an informative body of research. It's so great to see the science, and I really value the perspective you have that links the cultural burning and the removal of cultural burning from the landscape. I think that's a really important acknowledgement, and I think many people feel that returning fire is a first step of reconciliation as well. So thank you for that. My apologies, folks. I haven't done a good job of keeping us on time, and we're a little bit over right now. I am going to suggest that we stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes so that we can ask some questions. And maybe, Lori, because there was a question here, and thank you for people asking questions in the chat box and to people responding to them. One question that I don't think was responded to is from Heather Beresford, who I believe is in Whistler, who says, is there any research showing how wildfire thinning affects forest soil drying and affects fire behavior? There's a strong voice in my community that the thinning work is actually increasing our fire risk.
Did you want me to answer that one? I was just typing away as you speak, so it'll save me my fingers. It's Kelly here, Osborne.
Kelly, why don't we go to Lori first, and then you can come in after.
Sure. We'll leave it with Lori. That works.
Yeah, I'd be happy to hear Kelly's insights on this as well. Certainly when we open up the canopy, we begin to change the way wind speeds work, and we change the amount of direct solar insolation down to the ground. But I think it's also important to note that we're also changing our surface fuels at the same time. So we're reducing the accumulated wood on the ground. We're mitigating that through the pile burning or other mechanisms, which were clearly effective, as we saw with those measurements. You know, we do create small pieces of wood, fine fuels that accumulate on the ground during treatment, but the net effect has not increased relative to the untreated areas. And we're staying below critical thresholds. So we're also reducing the chance of fuels, or reducing the amount of fuels that could lead to intense under or surface fire, which would be the result or an impact of opening up that canopy and allowing those fuels to dry. I think as well, there are certainly trade-offs in both directions. And I think it also depends a little bit on the forest type that we are working in. In true boreal forests, I've referred primarily here to the dry forest types. There is some concern as we get up into the true boreal when we're working in spruce that have kind of oakies and lichen understories. We could also have some impacts, and there are concerns from boreal forest or fire ecologists about the impacts of treatments and the efficacy of them. And so I think we have to kind of think across that broad range of topics. And perhaps, Kelly, you'd like to add to that.
Not too much, Lori. I think you got it pretty well. I would say, there's a really tricky balance between how much influence on fire behavior, as Lori was suggesting, through modifying your surface ladder and overstory, you're going to gain in the wetter ecosystems when you come out to that threshold of where your unintended or potentially negative consequences start to interact. And so I think in those wetter ecosystems, we're never probably going to be able to achieve the risk reduction or threat reduction that folks may want, and that's why that marriage with Firesmart and all the other tools is really important in the wetter ecosystems, because those consequences of opening up the canopy a little too much. It's a very productive ecosystem. I live on the coast, and anytime you open it up, you're going to get invasive species, and then they dry out, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a simple solution on the coast. It's definitely a little bit trickier, but certainly, and there is some research, and we're investing in more moving forward to come to that understanding. But it really is kind of a stand level, site level decision to think about, the targets you're trying to achieve with, hitting that threshold of unintended consequences, which every forester should be looking at as they're, developing the prescription at that point in time.
Thanks,
I might
Kelly.
add as well, sorry, John, I'll just add one additional comment, and that's that, immediately following the treatments, there's very little in the understory. And so whatever is left on the forest floor is very exposed to drying. But we also see in those productive ecosystems recovery of the understory plants. And so those plants are responding in ways that also are creating a microenvironment that produces shade and microclimate attributes that are less conducive to burning also.
It's a great question. Thank you, Heather. It's something that all practitioners deal with is questions like that. A question I don't think got answered in the forum is from Ken Day, maybe Chris or Kelly. Is there any hope of changes in the open burning smoke control regulation with respect to fuel reduction treatments? And maybe Kelly or Chris, you could speak to that, and then we'll have time for a few more questions as well.
Hey, Kelly, do you want to give that one a go, or before I sort of step in there?
Sure. Can you just reread that? Sorry, did we ask it?
It's from Ken Day. Is there any proposed or expected changes in the open burning smoke control regulation with respect to
right?
Respond to there. Sorry, John, and sorry to Ken, because I sent it to John rather than the rest of the group.
Oh, okay.
And, I know that, Kelly, you're more sort of embedded into the detail of that, and
definitely, and really working closely with Rory. I think we do have the reduced requirements when you're working in the WUIs. It was a really big step forward when Obscure was being developed. And, they sort of have a mandate, and we're looking at our mandate and balancing them together. So there definitely is a recognition of, pile burning and resource management open fire activities, to when they're happening for community wildfire risk reduction objectives, and that could be at different places, as long as that objective is clear and approved by a land manager. That the reduced venting, and I can't remember exactly what the requirements are available. I also think, I know, Rory, we want to work and hear from different practitioners on some of the challenges. I do think that the Ministry of Environment would be looking for places where every sort of option to maximize the current legislation has been looked at. Rory mentioned things about when the venting is really good, to kind of, and the atmosphere can really take a lot of smoke, to maximize the amount of burning collectively with the different practitioners in those timeframes. And so being able to show that we've been able to do that, I'll answer that question in a second, and then go back and maybe have some suggestions, I think, is where we're going. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, Ken. Certainly, I actually would welcome you to follow up with Rory Caldwell, because he's sort of gathering some of that feedback and really working with practitioners on those opportunities. I don't know if custom venting is another one that might help being able to kind of maximize those opportunities to burn as they come up. So.
Thank you, Kelly. And I see Ken has put a note in the chat, and I think for practitioners, Ken, I know that it is a real concern. Thank you, Kelly and Chris, for the answer. Let's try and do two more questions. Thank you, folks, for staying over time. Evelyn Pinkerton, you ask, what about the effectiveness of Indigenous practices of patch burning, not only to allow berries to grow, but also to interrupt fires? Lori, have we studied do we know about objectively or scientifically the effects of cultural burning?
Yeah, so some of our tree ring reconstructions work like Kelsey's and others where we've worked on gridded study areas and had our plots across grids where we can reconstruct the size as well as the intensity or severity of the fires have really indicated to us that small patchy fires moving around the landscape were a very common portion of the historical fire regime. For some of our study areas, it's very clear that those had to have been Indigenous ignitions because of the size of the study areas, because of their relative locations on the landscape compared to barriers like water bodies, rivers, and other impediments to fire spread. So I think certainly the Indigenous practices also would have been relatively low intensity fires based on the oral histories and the knowledge shared. Much of those Indigenous fire stewardship practices occurred very early in the spring or late in the fall. They were using snow as fuel breaks and certainly making choices about where and how to implement fire. And that's based on knowledge either shared with us or that has been shared publicly from fire keepers and knowledge holders to help us to better understand fire. I don't know, Kelsey, if there's anything you would like to add. She has worked closely with the Williams Lake Band, both with the elders and with the archaeologists. And so there may be additional detail that she could share with us.
That'd be great.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak. And thank you, Evelyn, for that question. Part of what was really important for us was making sure that our results were really interpreted in the context of the stories that the Tahelt Williams Lake First Nation elders told us. And part of their stories were the concentration of really high value places, village sites, summer fishing camps, and travel corridors. And those were often most associated with those areas where we saw that high frequency of fire. And then across the site as a whole, we noticed that there was a really high proportion of fires that only burned in one place in 1 year. So these were not large fires. And for us, our interpretation is that speaks to what you were saying around the effectiveness of these highly frequent fires and kind of mitigating the effects of future widespread fires. And once those Indigenous ignitions were kind of forcibly removed from the land, we did see those kind of more widespread fires and the influx of trees that are changing the fire regimes.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Lori. There's so much to talk about here, and I wish we were together in real time to carry on this conversation. Unfortunately, we're over time. My apologies for not doing a better job managing the clock on this one. Susan and Jen, I'll hand it back to you to close the session. And thank you so much to the presenters for a fantastic and informative session.
Wow, yes. It would be great if we were just together and we could go grab our lunch and sit around and share it together. But I just really want to thank everyone. It was a really powerful presentation, a powerful session. And I thank you all for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and your wisdom. And it's definitely not the last time we have a panel like this on our conference agenda. There is definitely a lot more to talk about. And I'd like to say, by way of thank you, that a donation has been given in your honor to the Lytton Community Rebuild Fund. As we all know, they had a terrible fire this year. So your names will go off to them as a contribution to that fund.